But I want to start by talking a little bit about some stuff about this class, just to make sure it's going to be something that's going to be good for everybody that's here. Um, the topic of the class relates to the concept of witch blood, which is a concept that sometimes some people find a little controversial. I think it's starting to become a little bit more accepted in the community, um, but it's an idea that we see, or a way of describing ideas and characteristics we see across the world throughout history in terms of how witches were understood in traditional cultures. The idea that witchcraft has to do with types of spirit relationships and types of power and states of being that the witch exists in that are either inherently present in a person or passed lineally or acquired by certain dramatically changing experiences that someone has. And so it's a little different from a lot of the modern conventions about the idea of a witch and how someone becomes a witch. Um, it's a topic that's pretty close to me. My mother is a seventh daughter of a seventh daughter. And when she was a little girl and went into foster care, her first foster home, they would lock her in a closet because she was a witch when she was like 4 years old. And they didn't want her looking at people and casting magic on them because of that. There's a lot of hoodoo and magic in her family, and while my mother does not engage in that, there's a lot of perception in her family that she would be someone who would be a more powerful or frightening person to use that because of that quality of being a seventh daughter, which is a very common concept in a lot of traditional cultures. Um, so there may be some controversial elements. There might be some adult themes, although based on some of the conversation over here, I think we're fine with that. The and some of the traditional magical practices might involve some things that contemporary people might not be as comfortable with, but for the most part, we'll be talking about them on kind of like high level and not go into super detail about them. And we're also not necessarily advocating that all the things that are talked about here are things that people should be like, yeah, I should go out and do that right now. Some of them are things where it's more about thinking about these ideas and concepts and how they kind of work to create an understanding of a certain type of worldview and how the concept of the witch could operate and be achieved within that worldview. I'm also working on a book on this subject. Uh, don't have a title for it yet, um, but it'll go into more practical detail and also look at more contemporary concepts of how these ideas can be worked with for modern people, with a broad range of cultural examples as well as several modern new examples for how people can engage these ideas. So a little bit about me. I started studying and practicing magic when I was a little kid. So been involved in this stuff for about 30 years. Um, I tend to have a very history-driven way of approaching things. Academically, I'm trained as a classicist, and so a lot of stuff that I teach and a lot of stuff I talk about will lean very much into history. This is the only class out of the three that I'm teaching this weekend, though, that's not full of a bunch of dates and occurrences. This one's a little bit more idea laden. I've written three books, as well as been involved in a couple other publications. I'm from Maryland and flew here, so bringing a bunch of books was not practical. But I do have a QR code there by the water that if anyone is interested in checking out any of my books, you can scan the QR code and that'll take you to my Amazon author page. So to get started, kind of jumping off from the title of the class, talk about the concept of being born again. And usually when we think of that concept, we think of it in terms of born again Christianity. And as a kid, that was something that most people I knew laughed at. Like the idea sounded silly, like, "Oh, were you not born right the first time? Like, what's going on?" Um, and even in like mainline Christianity, like this is a concept a lot of people were like, "Why do people describe themselves this way?" Um, and I've seen it laughed at a lot in neo-pagan and magical communities. But you also see similar concepts come up in neo-pagan and magical communities. I was involved in the OTO for a very long time, and a lot of OTO people will talk about their initiation anniversaries as if it is a new birthday. People will talk about when they got into the craft or became a pagan as kind of like a new birthday, or their birth into that new subculture, or that new way of living or thinking about life in the world. Um, Sometimes you'll see people talk about neo-pagan religions as an awakening or returning home, is an alternative to talking about it being born into a new life. And I guess that has a little bit more continuity with who you were before, when it's talked about that way. But there's not a lot of difference between that concept in any sort of religion where people convert, or where people feel that they were part of it, but now they've chosen to turn to it more fully than they had before. Um, but these concepts are typically psychosocial. There's not frequently anything that is a major change in who the person is, or what their nature is, what they're capable of. Um, I mean, you get examples like a lot of the saints where they were rich playboys who went around and had lots of fun, and then they get knocked off a horse and are like, "Oh, I've been a bad person. I should go be saintly now." And so yeah, there is significant change. The change still is kind of psychosocial though, and so a lot of times you can't really discern what's different about somebody once they go through those sort of experiences. For the person, though, a lot of times there's a sense of belonging, comfort, happiness, or feeling at home. Sometimes there's a component of letting go of past traumas and past issues. And those things can be super important, and there's a lot of value to it. So we shouldn't discount those just because they're not necessarily some magical transformation or initiation that people are going through. They can still be meaningful on that psychosocial level. Um, but we should also look at whether or not it's possible for this concept to involve a more radical change in someone's life. And so, if we're talking about witchcraft, we want to look at what it is that that change is, when it's something where it's an indelible, fundamental change in the nature of that person's being. Um, so, discussing that, though, can be really tough unless we determine what we mean by witchcraft. So, I mean, looking at a program of classes, you could see a bunch of things where they're like, oh, we're going to talk about witches, we're going to talk about witchcraft, we're going to talk about this. It's like, okay, well, are we talking um, contemporary, like uber contemporary uh, religious witchcraft, where you go out and you buy a lot of crystals and you watch like TikTok videos and you curse the moon? Or are we talking about religious witchcraft more like what it looked like 10 years ago, where it's kind of loose, free, neo pagan approaches, where magic is used as kind of a religious way of engaging? Are we talking about um, traditional initiatory Wicca, where there's more of a mystery tradition component to it? Are we talking about tradcraft coming out of Robert Cochrane or Paul Hewson or Andrew Chumley, where they have a very different flavor, even if a lot of the elements are kind of similar? Or are we talking about more historical ideas of witchcraft before the magical revival of the late 19th and early 20th century? Those things can all be fairly different from each other. And as a result, a lot of people treat witchcraft as a nebulous, undefinable concept. And I think that can be kind of a big problem, because the purpose of a word is to give definition. Words are like a scalpel. You can take a chunk of material, and every word that you use to describe it cuts away a piece of that material until you have the actual shape and form of what it is. And in order for words to have that power, that magic behind them, they have to have actual meaning. There has to be depth to that meaning. But even from a non magical perspective, just to communicate, we have to have some sort of consensus on what words are. Um, a lot of times people try to define it fairly loosely, that a witch is someone who practices witchcraft, but that's kind of using the root to define the word itself. So it doesn't really tell us anything, especially when people can't tell us what witchcraft is. A lot of times when people use that definition, witchcraft is essentially synonymous to magic. So an initiate of the Golden Dawn is a witch in that context. Um, someone who is a Christian and says psalms over candles is a witch in that context, whether they think of themselves as that or not. Whereas historically, witch was a particular way of thinking about magicians. It was a particular way of engaging magic. It wasn't something where all people involved in magic were considered witches. There were lots of different terms to describe lots of different types of magic and describe lots of different types of magic practitioners in history. I don't necessarily want to go like the D&D route with that of like we need to have like a Mage the Ascension handbook and go through and pick out clans and types of magicians that way. But we should recognize that there's a diversity in magic, and that magic has lots of different ways of operating, and there's lots of different ways people can engage magic. It's not all the same for everyone. Um, the so a person is often said to be a witch because they decide they're a witch. But most things that you can be have criteria to what they are. And so we need to be able to understand what those criteria are. Is someone a witch just because they put on black clothes and uh, twirl around in flowing black dresses when they sing at concerts? Because I mean, by that definition, Stevie Nicks is a witch, and she says all the time that she's not, even though she shows up on witch shows like American Horror Story Coven. So it really is something where it's it's helpful not just for communication, but for us understanding what it is we're doing, who we are, what we're trying to be, to try to define these concepts and understand these words. And for this concept of a new birth to have meaning, we need to understand what that new birth creates. And through understanding what it creates, then that gives it gravity, that gives it power, that gives it meaning and purpose. And those are the things that I think a lot of us are looking for when we try to go through those sorts of transformations and changes. So, power, witch power particularly, is tied to the idea of the witch being the supernatural other. Now, in contemporary witchcraft, a lot of times witchcraft is a religion or it's a practice that someone elects. But throughout most of history, witch is a word that other people assign to you. It's not a word that you choose yourself. Now, a lot of people today would talk about the idea of reclaiming the word witch and gaining power through reclaiming it. Um, But typically, when people reclaim a word that's been used to describe their community badly, you're a part of that community before you reclaim the word. You have a right to the word before it's reclaimed. Whereas that was never the case with witchcraft. It was people trying to find and trying to discover what they thought witchcraft was and what they wanted witchcraft to be and creating something and then taking the term. So it's a little different from the idea of reclaiming. When we look at the witch as something that other people recognize you as, other people decide you're a witch, it's inherently tied to the concept of the other. Uh, Part of this ties into the idea that it's a name that's applied to you by people who aren't part of the group. Um, if we're being othered, if we're being pushed out beyond the bounds of society, then that's something where frequently there's going to be some element of us that does that to us. But there's also a significant part of that that's other people determining, hey, you're not part of us. You're separate from us. There's something about you that's different that we can tell is different. And that's an important part of the concept of othering, and ties to the idea that people create names for those things that they recognize as different and assign those names to things that they recognize as different. There is an argument that pagan identity was inherent to the concept of a sorcerer, both in terms of the early use of the word witch and in terms of the earlier Anglo-Saxon use of the term witcha. Uh, but this idea is based on the idea that images of witches were generally describing Danish invaders who were using pagan magic. Uh, the bulk of the English use of the word witch, though, there wasn't a particularly pagan component. It was significantly after that time period, and at a point where most people who were identified as witches were still understood as being Christian. In fact, the religious component that othered them was frequently that they were Catholic, as opposed to being Protestant. once Protestantism had taken over. A lot of times we talk about the importance of the repealing of the anti-witchcraft laws in England, and there was a really great blog post on Pathos, and I very rarely recommend Pathos blog posts, but Ian Chambers wrote it, and it was very good, where he talks about the repealing of the anti-witchcraft laws and how there's a lot of misconception about what that was, that most of the laws around witchcraft had already been repealed a long time before the repeal in the 20th century. And what the repeal in the 20th century was actually doing was creating a new law that protected against abuses through fortune tellers. Um, it's a little bit separate from what we're talking about, though. But understanding anti-witchcraft laws in England and the Atlantic Isles were mostly driven by the Protestant Reformation, and they were mostly targeted at rooting out and ending Catholicism at that point, as Protestantism was the new religion, where 1,000 years past the point where Christianity was the new religion by the time this is happening. Um, we can also identify witch figures in pagan culture who were not necessarily practitioners of foreign magics or separate religions. They were still part of the religious culture that they naturally inhabited, but they were still considered other from the rest of society. They weren't considered part of the standard social functioning and hierarchy. Um, and we can contemporarily identify witch figures in traditional cultures around the world where, again, they're not religiously distinct from the surrounding culture. It's their nature and power as a witch that makes them distinct from the surrounding culture. And so this concept of othering is not based on religious affiliation traditionally, or in traditional cultures still today, not based on religious difference, so much as it is the actual nature of the person as a witch, or what it is that makes them recognized as a witch in those cultures. Historical and folklore concepts of witchcraft overwhelmingly paint the witch as quasi supernatural. And when I say quasi supernatural, it kind of pulls from when I was a college student taking anthropology of witchcraft. I was like, are these spirits or are these people that they're talking about? Because they sound like both. Like, and when you would read ethnographies talking about witches in pretty much every culture where there's ethnographies about witches, you'd have magic practitioners that were like clearly human, clearly people that were part of society and were good and accepted and were people that you would go to when you had problems. Then you had some magic practitioners where it's like, okay, they're skirting the edge a little bit. Maybe they're good sometimes, maybe they're bad sometimes. Maybe you can go to them when you need some help. Maybe you can go to them when you want to mess somebody up. And then there are others that were more frightening, more on the outside, more beyond the bounds of the social structure, where people don't know who it is. People don't know if they live in the village. People don't know if they live outside the village in the forest. We're not going to get into the concept of the forest, but again, in a lot of cultures, that can be very important as a concept that ties to power, ties to the othering nature of witchcraft and the source of interaction with spirits. Um, though there are still elements of the witch in those cultures that are clearly human, though, but they're human and also something else. And so that's what I mean when I say quasi supernatural, is that there's this liminal quality where the witch has components where they're clearly a person, but there's some elements of them that aren't like people. There's some elements of them that are a little closer to spirits, and that adds to that wildness and that antagonism and that outsideness that is frequently tied to the image of the witch. The witch engages in activity with spirits in a free and communal manner rather than the more arm's length manner that we see in most religious engagement of spirits or in a lot of accepted magical manners of dealing with spirits. And there are a lot of traditional cultures where your people who are inside the culture and who are the accepted magical practitioners will have very intimate ties and intimate relationships with spirits. There was a really cool article a few years ago that I read about an African tradition where there's a serpent spirit that's located in a particular place, and every generation there's a person who's born who is the vessel for that serpent spirit, and they go sit beneath the tree where the serpent spirit resides, and the spirit descends down from the tree into them, and they kind of blend together so that people can come to the serpent spirit for help. And so there are those intimate, interwoven connections in several different types of magical functionaries and magical practitioners in lots of cultures. But there's also a lot where you have the magician as kind of this professional who has some religious status, maybe, and understands the names and rituals and powers to use to keep spirits at bay, to kind of command what spirits do for the benefit of the community, but they're not pals with the spirits. They're not like running around like, hey, let's dance together under the moon. Let's have you enter into me. Let me come into your world and deal with you. Um, the most obvious example of that for modern people is the role of an exorcist in Catholicism. Um, we won't go into exorcists in Protestantism because they're just weird. But the uh, but that kind of arm's length thing, that's something where we can see that in lots of cultures and lots of places in the world. Even when you read Mesopotamian accounts of work with spirits, like the Maklu, where it's destroying the power of witchcraft that someone has engaged in, or some of the exorcisms calling upon various divine powers to destroy the evil desert wind that brings sickness, and the various demons that can vex people. There's not a sense that the priests and magicians who are doing that are people who are directly engaged in intimate spirit relationships. They're people who are connected to the gods and aware of the gods and are able to use that to protect people from these spirit relationships, because it's kind of like the world of fairy tales. Fairy tales are written to warn us against engaging with spirits because for the average person that's dangerous. That's something where they're not equipped to do it. The witch isn't the average person, though. The witch often is understood as someone who has the power that allows them to command or frighten certain spirits because of their nature. But this power also allows them to navigate and interact with spirits on a more safe and equal footing than non-supernatural people. So like anyone can go sit on the rock by the crossroads in the woods where the fairies are known to hang out and be taken to become the fairy babysitter who thinks they're going to get married to the fairy king until they do something wrong and they get sent back and then they cry and are sad for the rest of their life. Multiple Irish folk stories like that. The but the witch is somebody who they can go in and they can be like, hey, you're not gonna trick me or treat me like you're treating these like random village girls that are coming thinking they're gonna have a fairy adventure. I've got some power here. I know what I can do and how to interact with you. The witch is able to travel to spirit places, and they may be compelled to travel to spirit places. In a lot of folklore, it's not something where the witch has total choice in this matter. There's an element of the nature of the witch that draws them into these places, that compels them to spirit flight, compels them to be able to see spirits, and it's not necessarily something that uh, they're choosing to do. Which, like, as an aside, like, it's not anything I've got a note on, but it's something that I've often thought about of what that has to be like for somebody where they have that nature and they have that kind of power and experience, but they don't grow up in a family that's aware of it, where they're alone. Like if, say, they're adopted, or say it's been a couple generations since that power is manifested in anyone, or maybe it manifested in some remote relatives that they don't know. And so they have these bizarre dreams and experiences. They see these bizarre things, and you've got to wonder, like, how many people just think they're crazy or think there's something wrong with them when there's something sort of beautiful and special about them that's being missed. I think that's really can be sad, but and hopefully those people uh, find answers. A contemporary understanding of this is that the witch is both human and spirit in a way that's different from typical living embodied humans. Certain types of spirit work, particularly consistent work with the dead, can create a state that's not entirely unlike this, but it's also not quite the same. Is there anyone here who does a lot of ancestor work or necromantic work? So have you ever had people who, like you're getting a reading or you're just dealing with someone who's perceptive and they're like, there's something about you that it seems like you've got one foot in the world of the dead. It seems like you're kind of walking alongside with the dead. Um, I had an experience once where got a reading from a Lakumi priest, and he was like, "Okay, hold on," and he had to go draw a symbol on the door to keep death out because death was after me because straddling that line so much and kind of living in the spaces of the dead while being living and living in the spaces of the living. And so it's something to be aware of when you're doing that kind of work. It's not entirely the same though. It's something where uh, you've got an intimate familiarity. You have some byways to go through those spaces, but it's something you could step away from if you choose to. If it's something that's created simply by you electing that work and doing that work frequently. People living in conditions of marginalization and people with certain differences in mental functioning may also exist in a state that's adjacent to the spirit world. And so this is something where, in some living traditions of magic, there's an awareness that if you go to the bus stop or you go to the space under an overpass or under a bridge, and because those are spaces that are kind of a little othered, they're kind of liminal. Any space that involves hubs of travel will be kind of a liminal magical space. Um, you leave offerings there. It's going to be vagrant people and itinerant people that take those offerings. Um, but that isn't a bad thing because a lot of times those people, they can become channels and conduits for spirit presences without them necessarily trying to or realizing that that's something that's happening with them because they're existing in a state that's already a little bit outside of society. They're existing in a state where there's stresses on their body and mind that push them outside of normal ways of perception and understanding and experience. Has anyone ever had like an experience where it's very clear that a god or a spirit has come up and talked to you through like a homeless person or some sort of itinerant or vagrant person um, through dreams? Yeah, like there's certain conditions where you've engaged in a lot of spirit work that can be a thing that becomes not uncommon at certain points because a lot of those people are already on the edge of being in touch with those powers, whether they're choosing to be or not. Um, the witch is liminal, and the witch is other. Those are core concepts to understanding the nature of the witch. And so we have to understand what it is to be the other. And it's a phrasing that it seems odd in English to say the other. That person is the other. This is the other. It's like, what is the other? Other is a descriptor. It's not a noun. Um, but the other is a social concept by which a person or being is set apart from the community for some difference perceived as defining their identity. Now, all of us, I'm sure, can think of lots of different ways that someone could be other in that context. Now, it's not always limited to individuals. It can also apply to subgroups that are distinct from the overculture and disallowed from the community to the point where they might not be seen as human. Um, it's really unfortunate to think about, but looking at a lot of the history in Europe, particularly in Eastern Europe, this was something that Jewish communities suffered through. And Sarah Mastros, who's another presenter that's here this weekend, she has frequently mentioned that people need to keep in mind that a lot of the stereotypes and rhetoric against witches in the early modern period and late medieval period were a transition of stereotypes and accusations that had been levied against Jewish people. Um, I can't remember the name of the author, but there was a doctoral dissertation talking about blood concepts in the medieval and early modern period, and it highlights that very clearly that it was easier to tie this kind of othering and this sense of danger of something separate in the community and to get out the community's need to sort of marginalize and have scapegoating by applying it to witches, because it was a more nebulous community. It was more there's more of a question of who it was, and there wasn't a unified culture of witches. And so that was possibly part of the transition of that scapegoating, moving from primarily being assigned to the Jewish community in Europe and being assigned to witches in Europe. Uh, the process can be part of a matter of recognizing existing differences. So sometimes there are things that make people different from the rest of the community, and people see that, and that can be the start of othering people. But it frequently also involves a perception of distant differences that is there to justify exclusion. And frequently those differences are exaggerated at that point. Sometimes those differences are fantastical at that point. But it doesn't matter because it serves that scapegoating need that the community has. There are some magicians who describe the other as any sort of non-human spirit entity. I think that's based on just not being familiar with the concept in history and social sciences, um, and so they need something to understand that what the word means. Um, but the term is used in social sciences not specifically as a term related to magic or the supernatural. In fact, my original encounter with the term was in a cultural studies course where we were doing a unit on the 1931 German lesbian film Girls in Uniform. And when I encountered the concept there, I thought this is such an amazing way of thinking about how this element of social interaction works. And so I've been really thrilled to see how it's moved into the common vernacular of discussing witchcraft in magical and pagan spaces today, because it wasn't something that you ever saw people talk about the witch as other 15, 20 years ago. But now it's something that comes up very commonly. And it's a very important concept to understanding the nature of the witch in folklore and history.
When did, excuse me, the concept of the other become mainstream? I mean, I don't even think that term, I don't recall in reading the civil rights movement or anything.
Yeah, I first encountered it around probably 2001, 2002. And I encountered it in a cultural studies milieu. I I think as there has been more progressive dialectics and discourse around different subcultural groups and different marginalized communities, it's entered into those spaces somewhat. And a lot of that discourse has really progressed over pretty much the last 9 years or so, where there are things that no one was talking about before, and no one perceived as people maybe perceived there as being problematic elements, but not problematic elements that anyone needed to deal with or address. And I think as there's been more discourse around that, the need for more language to discuss those things has become more common. And so we're seeing that kind of language in more spaces now. In terms of it being a common term in magic and witchcraft and neo-pagan and pagan communities, I feel like it's probably the last like 5 to 7 years that I've seen it more commonly used in discussions and forums, and where more people are understanding it. But I also see a lot of people where a conversation will come up, people will talk about othering, people will talk about the witch as other, they'll talk about the importance of being othered as part of that experience. And there'll inevitably be people who are like, what's that mean? What is it to be the other? What is the other? And so it's not a term that is fully diffuse through the community yet, but it seems like it's getting there. Um, we, when we think about being othered, we think of it as marginalizing. But there is a power in othering, both in the sense that there's power that can be obtained through being the other, and in the sense that obtaining power causes you to be the other. There is a circular self-feeding loop that happens there with that nature. The other is consistently marginal, but the witch can take power from marginal spaces. Being marginalized means you're on the edge. And so that means you can move outside of where the rest of the community moves. You can move through spaces that other people can't move through. And if you can own that and take control of that, there's a power there that other people don't have. There's connections that can be built and that can be leveraged and that can be used that other people don't have. And that's a form of power. The witch has elements of agency based on being at odds with social norms. You're already on the outside of things. Maybe there's things that are okay to do that wouldn't be okay if you were on the inside of things. A joke that has come up frequently with the unfortunate condition our society is in since the overturning of Roe versus Wade is you're already going to be considered a criminal if you go and take care of a situation that's unwanted. What other criminal acts should you just go ahead and do on the way there to deal with other things that are a problem? It's the same idea. If you're already pushed into that space where you have to view things outside of the way the rest of society views them, where you have to experience things outside of the way the rest of society experiences them, and where you're already perceived as being someone who's breaking the rules, as somebody who's not fitting into the mold, why not break the mold a little more? Why not find ways to use that to your advantage and take power from that? And so there are social power elements that are there, in addition to the kind of real and intrinsic power elements that we're going to talk about. The queering and marginalizing effect of the witch's difference from others may incline the witch towards the liminal space of spirits and occult perception. Events like this are great for understanding this concept because you can walk around and you can see people who very clearly are celebrating their difference. And they're not different because they joined the neo-pagan community. They're not different because they became a pagan. They're not different because they decided they were going to go engage in witchcraft. They're different because they're different. There are elements of them that are unique and that are their own, that are separate from what people commonly experience. And there's lots of people where maybe they're not wearing it, where it's out in the open and to see. I mean, I'm here in a shirt and tie and a sweater. You probably would just look at me walking by and be like, "Well, that guy's pretty normal."
I was not sure you were part of con. You looked like you might have just been a hotel.
Yeah. And,
is that Muji?
well, I think there's also an important power to that gets overlooked in witchcraft is that a lot of times we talk about how because the witch is other, because the witch is marginal, that the witch has to connect with certain spaces in the social construct. My view on that is because the witch has power, the witch can be whoever they want. So there are times where I can go be the wild Dionysian priest who's not really dressed that I am in some functions. There's times where I can go be the well-dressed financial advisor that I used to be. And the witch should have the power to move through those spaces once they take control of the power of their marginal state. But the fact that some of us are just born a little different, that we're going to experience society in a different way than other people, as that pushes us into spaces as the outsider, and spaces where we might be cut off from certain types of interaction that we see with other people, that might also push us into spaces where we're more open to perceiving other things than other people are. It might push us into spaces where we're less distracted by some of the things that other people do, or it might push us into spaces where we're more attentive to things that other people aren't attentive to because we have the room to be attentive to those things, or because we're seeking some sort of connection that's not there with other people. So that difference, that marginalization, and when I say queering, there I don't necessarily mean in a sexual way, although it can have that component to it, but in the way of being within multiple spaces at once. It's sort of an alternative way of describing liminality and kind of the quantum nature of the witch experience. Being kind of pushed into spaces adjacent to that can help awaken people to those experiences and those modes of understanding and connecting with reality that might not have otherwise innately been there for them as much as they might be for some people. The supernatural nature of the witch involves a power which is inherently othering. So when we talk about witch fire, or we talk about witch blood, or this nature and this power that shapes the witch and gives the witch their ability to connect with the spirit world and interact with the spirit world and have leverage and command over some things in the spirit world, that power itself is an othering force that changes and warps and twists things. And that's an important part of the nature of what the witch's power is and what the witch's engagement of magic is. The witch's power isn't one where it's like, okay, I'm gonna learn all these like weird god names, and I'm gonna figure out like which drapery I need to put up, and then I'm gonna knock on the table the number of times for the correspondence I'm gonna do. And witches can do all that if they want, uh, but the nature of witch power is that twisting of spaces and times and conditions and potentials. The witch is at the middle of the crossroads. The witch is standing in the doorway where they're neither in one room or the other room. They're in both rooms and are able to conduct things through them and choose which room to lean into at a time, which direction along crossroads to lean into at a time, or which things to let through. If you think about Hecate and the nature and powers of Hecate, and then the connection with witchcraft, which is both a connection with protecting against and keeping away witchcraft, as well as a connection with teaching and creating witchcraft. Those powers of being the key holder, of being the guardian of the crossroads, of being the threshold minder. Those are all things that deal with that liminality and that ability to transition potentials between spaces and hold multiple potentials at once and determine what potential comes through and manifests through the witch's interaction with the spaces and the forces and the powers and the beings that they're dealing with. Now, you'll note that I described it as a supernatural nature, and liminality and supernaturalness are both important to the concept of the witch. But a lot of times we're not used to describing things as supernatural in contemporary magic because there was a drive towards magic being perceived as science, and that created a rhetoric against the supernatural. When I was like 12 years old reading Scott Cunningham, I was super impressed by the idea that everything that occurs in nature, so all phenomena are natural, therefore magic and witchcraft are natural. And that idea makes witchcraft seem safe, it makes witchcraft seem natural and rational, but witchcraft should be neither safe nor rational in a conventional sense. There needs to be some break with that normalcy and that fully, yeah, that kind of rationality implies. And as I said in a class yesterday, if you're dealing with any real magic, there's danger, there's risk because you're changing things. There's things that are in flux. It's just like if you walk out your door, there's danger because there is change, because there are factors that are involved that can impact things. And when you have something that has power, that's the nature of power. It's the ability to move things, to cause things to happen. And any time that's happening, there's risk involved. So witchcraft shouldn't be fully safe, and it shouldn't be conventionally rational. It can be rational in a way, but that rationality needs some other worldview elements to it. And this idea that there is no supernature, that there's nothing beyond what we consider natural, is really a wholly materialist view. And as paganism and neo-paganism and witchcraft and magic return to those kind of animistic roots of understanding the living nature of the world and the fecundity of spiritual life within the world, we can't approach that from that fully materialist view anymore. In traditional worldviews, nature is a particular portion of creation. It's not everything. And it's also the personification of that portion of creation. Frequently, nature is understood not just as the world around us, but as the living conscious component of the world around us. and the collective life of the world around us. Nature is the living and embodied sublunar world and its embodied inhabitants. And that's pulling from kind of a Neoplatonic view, but if we grew up in Western culture, the Neoplatonic view is interwoven into everything on some level. The celestial world and spirits are supernatural. They're not part of the natural world. They exist beyond the agency and limits of nature. Some elements of human existence and experience partake, or at least are in part things that are overlapping the supernatural. We have souls, we have spirits, we have things where we engage with things that are beyond just what's experienced in the physical world around us. And so there are parts of every human that partake of these supernatural elements. But the witch liminally inhabits both the natural and supernatural spaces and perceives both and has natures from both that exist interpenetratively. There's an interwoven quality between the supernatural and the natural elements for the witch, as opposed to we have mostly natural experiences and then we have some supernatural experiences, which is more the characteristic of the average person in the average experience. Traditional views of witchcraft in most culture treat the witch's nature as something the witch possesses naturally or acquires. So as opposed to something where you can just be like, you know what? I feel like I'm a witch. Like, they seem pretty cool. I like that archetype. I'm gonna go call myself a witch now. Uh, the witch is a state of being. Now, that state of being can be transient. There may be times where, in some cultural examples, in some folklore, a person might be a witch because that's what they are at that moment, but they're not necessarily a witch all the time. Particularly in some of the early Anglo-Saxon poetry and Anglo-Saxon examples, we see this, where you can have someone who sometimes they're a person, sometimes they're a Valkyrie, sometimes they're a Dis, sometimes they're a witch. And it depends on, in part, what they're doing at the time, but how what they're doing changes the nature of their being at that moment. And so natures and being can be in flux, particularly for people who are able to tie to and connect to those powers. But there are also people where that state of being is just who they are at all times from the beginning. And there are people who can undergo intense experiences that create that state of being indelibly in who they are from that moment on. Um, the da, 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 da. So when we understand the witch is supernatural and this concept of supernatural, which is, I like to describe it as recognizing that to be a witch, you kind of have to be a little bit of a supernatural monster. Ian Corrigan, his former Arc Druid of the ADF, we were talking once, and I was advocating for this historical and folklore perspective on witchcraft, and he was like, "But we can't have that today because you'd have to be a supernatural monster to be a witch." And I was like, "Well, if we flip that around, maybe if you're not a supernatural monster, maybe you're not a witch. Like maybe that's what you have to be." And when we start to understand that that's an experience that people can have, our world becomes a little bit bigger and a little bit more interesting. Um, we have to understand the witch within the mythic space of traditional cultures and worldview. And now, myth doesn't mean fantasy or untrue story. And I feel like even in contemporary neo paganism, a lot of times there is a sense that it's like myths are just stories, myths are things that people made up. We can change myths around and say whatever we want about myths because they're just these fantasy stories that people told. I was in a course on um, Northern European mythology in college, and there was a point where some of the people in the class started talking about myths as the pop culture of the ancient world, and I just twisted inside because myths are inherently true. The details of a myth might vary. The details of the myth don't have to be true on a surface level or in relation to the progress of events in the material world. but they're still true. They convey something true about reality on some level of being. And typically, even if we're talking about an etheric or a divine or a mythic space where these myths are real and play out, there's still some impact, some echo, some reverberation in the natural or the material world, where these myths convey a truth about our world, even if the details of them are not true details from our world. And comprehending that mythic perspective allows us to understand the spiritual dimension of the world as a real, present, adjacent, interpenetrative, and interwoven component of the world we experience. How much more beautiful and alive is the world when we recognize that the worldview Homer describes, where you're going through a battlefield and the gods are walking through that battlefield doing things on the battlefield also, where maybe you don't see them directly, but you see the impacts, you see the effects of their presence on the world. How much bigger and brighter and more intense and interesting is the world when we see it that way and we understand that and we live in that space. This kind of presents to us the opportunity to understand two different modes of how we think about witchcraft. And it's a kind of division or dialectic that's occurred to me in the last few weeks. The idea of witchcraft as fairy tale versus witchcraft as fantasy. Fairy tales are real. Fairy tales are a sort of myth. Now you have fairy tales that aren't real. You have fairy tales that are fun stories that are made up. But you also have fairy tales that warn us about the spiritual nature of the world. There are fairy tales that warn us about human nature, fairy tales that warn us about experiences that we're going to have. And you can read those fairy tales, and there's a sense that something in them is true, that there may have been a person who experienced something related to this. And maybe the story accreted elements over time and grew and changed and was reshaped. Because some of our classic fairy tales, we think of them as coming from like the Grimm brothers or coming from Germany in like the early modern period. And I mean, the Grimms, they're not even early modern period. They're like the 18th century, I think. But a lot of these fairy tales are thousands of years old. There's a theory that the Seven Sisters might be a story so old that it's older than human migrations because it occurs in distinct parts of the world that are geographically unconnected and that there wasn't travel between. And it references the Pleiades when you could still see all seven stars, which was like way long ago. So fairy tales have a truth to them. Fantasy can be inspired by truth. Fantasy can be meaningful and can be connected to things that humans experience. But fantasy is often an answer to our experiences rather than an illustration of what is. Fantasies can be a little bit more fantastical, and they don't have to be rooted in anything. So when we say witchcraft is a fairy tale, then we're talking about the bizarre and supernatural experience of witchcraft rooted in the real and the experiential presence of a queering, othering, liminal power. When we talk about witchcraft as fantasy, and that's not a derision, it can still be important. We're looking at the focus on an identity for comfort and empowerment, and the shaping of a worldview and the application of an archetype because of the desire and feeling that this brings, without having to be driven by an intrinsic witching power. Oh, thank you so much. But both of these can be meaningful, and both of these can be useful based on a person's needs. Some people, you from childhood maybe saw ghosts, maybe saw spirits, maybe would slip between worlds sometimes. And so that fairy tale existence, it's just what you are. It's just what is. Some people, life is hard and you feel bullied. You feel marginal. You feel like you don't have power. and looking at this archetype that's powerful, this archetype that gives a shape to power and courage and being able to stand up against all of that can be important, even if all it does is make you feel better, it makes you feel stronger and more resilient without necessarily giving you real power to change things or change things other than your own perception and your way of responding to things. So both of those are things people need, but they are very, very different things. And it's important to be able to understand that difference and talk about that difference and the different spaces that those things occupy. Within this perspective, the witch as both human and supernatural becomes a fully rational concept. Now, I talked before about how witchcraft can't be rational in a conventional sense. So, in our modern view of what's rational, witchcraft isn't rational. But in a view where there's a bigger world that's more alive and inhabited by more powers and more things that can be more transient and move between different spaces, then this idea of being quasi supernatural becomes a rational idea that fully fits that context. And most people who've really experienced magic, even if they haven't thought about witchcraft this way or thought about this idea of being quasi supernatural, when you think about your experience of magic and your understanding of the magical world, then it does kind of make sense that this is something that can be out there. Um, the witch is a liminal or quantum figure existing as someone who is both part of the material world and the spirit world in a more dynamic and engaged way than the average person. And traditional beliefs regarding witches are based in this understanding in cultures around the world. The witch's access to magic and relationship with magic is based on this intersectionality. And we kind of talked about that already with this sort of crossroads nature, this nature of being able to use that liminality to transition things through into and out of existence and change and shape what comes into being within one's life. While the witch may engage in magical acts similar to other magicians, it's done through a different agency and based in this nature that can be understood like straddling or oscillating between material and spirit natures, and the liminality inherent in creating a relationship with potentiality. We talk about optionality and we talk about potential in magic, that the more opportunities for things to manifest and come into existence makes it easier to manifest things. But we don't frequently talk about the fact that magic has to do with directing some of that optionality. And that's particular to the nature of witchcraft, that witches are dealing with that flow of optionality, that flow of the idea that the cat is both dead and alive until you open the box. Um, all magic kind of deals with that. But a lot of magic deals with it in a very external way, whereas the witch experiences it in a very internal way. And I think that's something that a lot of people have understood about witchcraft versus like contemporary ceremonial magic, is that there's more of an internal component with witchcraft. There's more of an intimate component with witchcraft, whereas some systems there's more of an intellectual component, more of an externalizing component, more of a categorizing component. Whereas witchcraft involves a fluidity that moves through that instead of always having to chop things into pieces. And to me, that gets to, again, to that diversity of magic and that diversity of magical experience, and that there are different types of practices and different ways of engaging magic. But it also becomes really interesting where you can have people who have that witching nature and they can go engage magic in other types of systems and engage it from the same mentality of those other systems. But they can also engage it from that witching perspective, where the way they're engaging it might be inherently and intimately different than the way that other people are engaging it, because it's just part of their their nature. And so a lot of people often talk about like they don't like the idea of witch blood because it seems sort of elitist. It seems like, okay, you're saying there's these special people who have this special thing and only these people can do magic, and no one actually ever says that. It's that it's just a little different. And if you really look at like the history and culture around it, it's also something that people can obtain if they don't have it already. Um, so it doesn't have to be about that. But I think the biggest thing for me that makes it not about elitism is, and this is something that like has come up frequently when I'm hanging out with other people who come from that sort of background and have that kind of experience, is that really it just kind of creates a little bit of eccentricity. And a lot of times your magic will seem weird and broken and glitchy. And so sometimes it's a little harder to fully engage and fully analyze things the same way other people do, because sometimes some things are a little easier to do in a broken, glitchy way. And so you end up getting like weird magic sometimes, which to me it's like the opposite of elitism. Um, in a larger context, we could explore common elements of witch folklore and traditions that illustrate this nature. But in an hour and a half class where we're kind of talking about different pieces of this, I can't go through and be like, well, in 15th century Italy, it looked like this, but in 20th and 21st century Nyimba culture in Nepal, it looks like this, and in uh, South American cultures, it looks like this. And when I put out my book on this subject, it will actually go through a bunch of those things for people that are interested in stuff like that. But in our context today, what we really want to come away with is the understanding of the witch as othered, the witch is both human and supernatural or inherently liminal, and the witch is a possessor of witchcraft. And notice I said possessor of witchcraft, not doer of witchcraft. And this is a reframing that I think is very important. Again, go back to like a lot of people describe like, well, what's a witch? Oh, a witch is someone who practices witchcraft. Well, what is practicing witchcraft? What's that look like? Well, I don't know. It's magic. When we talk about the witch as a possessor of witchcraft, we're talking about power. The German word from which we take our word craft can mean skill. The word is also Kraft in German, but it can mean skill, but it can also mean power. Witchcraft is witch power. It is the othering force that creates that liminal relationship and the power generated by that liminal state that allows for causing change and leveraging throughout the spirit world. And I think, again, that circular relationship is really important, that the power of witchcraft makes someone liminal. Like, you can't have that and not be liminal. It's going to force you into liminality. But liminality also creates power, not just in the operant sense of if you're standing on both sides of the door, you have access to both rooms. If you're standing at the middle of the crossroads, you have access to each of the spokes coming off the crossroads. It creates power in a way of opposition, in a way of movement and motion, that there are multiple elements existing in a dynamic structure with each other, where there's constantly an interplay of opposition and interaction, and that movement creates force. In other magical contexts, I'll often talk about spiritual charisma, and I'll talk about it as a friction or a capacitance, that when we prepare for magical rites in like the grimoire traditions, we spend days or weeks denying ourselves for things that we want. And if you spend days and days being like, I really like chocolate, but I'm not going to eat chocolate. I really want to relax and have a drink, but I'm not going to have a drink. I really want sex, but I'm not going to have sex. It's not like that desire goes away. A lot of times that desire amps up as you deny yourself. But at the same time, as you're denying yourself, you take away some of the distraction that those things create. And so there's an element where there's a little bit more focus and a little more desire, but at the same time, less focus. And these two states that are oppositional to each other exist at the same time. And creating that polarity within oneself and amplifying that polarity creates that kind of magnetic movement where you are creating a capacitance of force by creating that opposition and creating the friction and change between those two states, constantly dynamically interacting within yourself. And that's what the witch is naturally. The witch naturally has that capacitance, that liminality that people try to seek through putting themselves into states that create stressors on the body and the mind and differences in what you're experiencing from what your normal experience is and what sort of your desired experience may be. Um, we also want to understand the witch as a state of being rather than assumed identity. Witches are either born or made. And while the concept of witches being born is not super popular today, the concept of witches being made still is fairly common in modern witchcraft and still fairly popular in modern witchcraft. In this context, there is a meaning to the experience of transformation beyond just the psychosocial meaning. In a lot of folklore and a lot of cultures throughout the world, someone can acquire witchcraft power by being born under certain conditions. Being born on certain days, being born at certain times, having certain physical elements in their birth, like in the Mediterranean world. Most people here are familiar with Nazar amulets, the evil eye amulets. They're blue eyes because almost no one has blue eyes in the Mediterranean. So if you're born with blue eyes, you have the evil eye naturally. You're a witch. You have power that other people don't have. The being born with a cowl, being born with a vestigial tail. The Benandanti, consistently, to be Benandanti, you have to be born with a cowl. And the cowl marks you as Benandanti, and you don't have a choice. There will be a point where the leader of the Benandanti troop comes for you in spirit flight, and your soul has to go with them. I think there are some accounts in some trial cases where people do acknowledge that you can renounce it eventually, or it will taper off eventually. But the initial interaction with that power is something that people have to engage in. They don't have a choice in it. And that's something that's very common in traditional cultures and traditional ideas of witchcraft. But it's also a power that can be acquired through spirit interactions. And it's not just witches that gain power through spirit interactions. In a lot of sorcery traditions, there's a concept of infection. And they might not describe it in those cultures as infection, but there's a lot of sorcery systems where there is a lineal component to it, but the lineal component's not based on you being born into a family that has this magic. It's based on someone giving you power, giving you magic, giving you spirit relationships that have been honed over time by select people and functionaries within that culture. And the way that's transmitted, sometimes someone spits in your mouth and you have to swallow their spit so their power infects you. And sometimes you have to be cut in certain patterns and have herbs and substances rubbed into the cuts so that there's an infection of that power that grows inside of you. In some less invasive versions of it, like in some Eastern European magic systems, where there is also a family component to it, the member of the family that has that power already spits on you instead of spitting into you. So at least you're not swallowing someone's spit. You're just having your mom or grandmother spit in your face, and then reading spells to you so that you acquire the power to do those spells. But there's an infectious element. And frequently there's a sorcery sickness that goes with this, that in the process of that initiation, you have several days of being feverish and delirious and ill as that power incubates in your body and as the spirits tie themselves to your bones, so that you have the ability to access them in a more intimate way than other people can. Um, when we talk about this in the concept of acquiring that power in witchcraft, it's not just tying these connections to people and having this fire be added to you. It's having that fire created through a restructuring and reshaping of your inherent nature and state of being, which also can be kind of painful and intense. So how is this state of being achieved? So as we talk about this in the state of being, we're going to focus on ways that this power is gained by people. We're not really going to talk about it being inborn because that's not super interesting. And you can't go out and make yourself born away if you weren't. So it's not useful. But this concept of inherent or innate power, again, we've already talked about it not being the same as being exclusionary because people can go out and develop it. There's ways to get it. And the first way is through carnal knowledge. So as you said, there'd be some adult themes. Um, s- so this is thank you. The most common image for how a witch gets power is sex with a spirit. Everyone is aware of that idea. Um, my former partner a couple years ago showed me the movie Hexen, which was like old silent movie era, and even that's like talking about witches having sex with the devil and getting power from having sex with the devil. It's a salacious enough concept that it's popular for pop culture, so it's one that lots of people are familiar with. It has been tied to some really horrible ideas through history, but that doesn't mean it's not something that has a truth to it or something that comes from something real. So, what does sex with a spirit look like? Um, Sometimes sex with a spirit can be an evoked intentional possession. Um, in my book Familiar Unto Me, I talk about this and the possibility of like people working partnered magic, where if there's a familiar spirit involved, where sex is a component of the relationship with the familiar spirit, then one person in the partnership might engage in voluntary possession and allow the spirit to experience sexual intercourse through their body. That kind of invoked intentional possession, though, usually isn't the kind of spirit sex that will create that changing dynamic that warps the nature of your being into something new. Then there's the mysterious stranger. Um, I conducted a group ritual once for encountering the witch's devil and gaining familiar spirits and making a pact in order to gain power and knowledge. And one of the people who attended it came later and said that the three nights of sex that were promised to the witch's devil in that ritual manifested in them being on a business trip and them encountering this person they'd never encountered before who seemed a little strange and different, and they weren't really sure about them, and they had some really intense interesting sex. um, so that's one way that it can manifest, that idea that spirits can kind of come into your life and work with you through people who sort of move in and move out for the moment that you need that interaction. There's the dream visitor, where a lot of fairy spells around sex with fairies from the early modern period, it's either clearly implied or clearly stated in them that you have your dinner with the fairies and then the sexual encounter with the fairies will happen when you retire to bed and go to sleep and you encounter them in your dreams at that point. Then there's weight and presence, where you may offer yourself to a spirit in that way, and so you engage in masturbatory magic, but you can feel that almost physical presence in the room over top of you, and there might not like maybe there is a visual where like whatever fantasies or images you have are directed by that spirit, uh, but there's definitely a sense of something being there with you, something being up against your body and kind of in contact with you and the overall space, where it's bigger and more overwhelming than just the space on top of you, but throughout the space that you're existing in at that point.
In those cases on all three, sort of invoking, it's consensual. What happens if it's not?
Then you should do some banishing and tell the spirit like that's not okay behavior.
Yeah,
But
that, but as far as
will it still create that change? Possibly, yes. And I think there's definitely folklore elements where it's not something that the person is necessarily choosing to do. There are lots of folklore examples where the person is choosing to do it. And there are definitely witch trial cases. And when we look at witch trial cases, you have to kind of look at them and look at like where they're coming from, when they're coming from, and what's being said. And there are some, they're clearly based in stuff that was really happening. There were clearly people really doing magic. There were clearly witches. And you can look at them and be like, we can learn a lot of stuff from them. Then there's others where you're like, people were freaking crazy and everyone had lost their minds and a bunch of people were harmed because everyone was freaking nuts. And there's not good folklore in them. There's not good history in them. It's just fantasy at that point. So a lot of like your like French stuff is just bonkers. But you got some Italian stuff that's really good. There's some British stuff and some stuff from the Atlantic Isles that's really good. So
What about the America in Salem?
that's mostly just like
Crazy.
yeah, just
bonkers.
craziness. Yeah, and so I mean, but there are some elements where like Tituba may have actually had some background with some magic stuff and may have actually shown some things to some people, but most of it was just people going nuts. The actually, I have an ancestor not from Salem, but in their witch trial case, um, they accused someone else of being a witch, but their description of the experience was them experiencing these witchy spirit trance states. And the person that they accused was acquitted because everyone in the community is like, they are clearly not a witch. But then they were found guilty of witchcraft and were no, they were exiled. So it was before the witch craze. It was an earlier the witch craze in Salem. So it was an earlier case. The nap witches? I don't think so.
Good wife or good in
Mhm.
She was the first one executed, I think, in Connecticut.
Okay, yeah.
And then a few generations later, there was another nap on that line that was happenings, but she worked for, she was like the help for maybe someone in the community that had some standing, and it lasted for a little while and it stopped.
Mhm.
And she was never persecuted because of her age. So that's where I'm descended from.
Oh,
My grandmother was a nap. So that, when I found those connections, it just kind of put me in a different place of understanding about that. More so the younger one than the one that was first.
cool. And I think that can also be an important element to look at when you see examples where there's things that are recognizable and where it isn't part of just like people going nuts and just killing everybody. Then those are cases where you can kind of look at them and be like, okay, there's probably something here.
There's a type of like fungus that grows on
Mm-hmm.
that occurs every so many years, and they're finding evidence that it might have happened during the time of Salem witch trials, and
Yep.
then that leaf gets used to make beer, and it basically is like making poison.
Yeah,
So
and
like their beer might have been bad, and that's why all of this happened.
yeah, there are a lot of theories around the ergo fungus and the kind of the hallucinations that can create. So, does all spirit sex make witches? I don't think so. Uh, in some folklore, it just needs to happen once, and in some folklore, it happens over time, where repeated exposure to that kind of intimate interaction with the spirit creates the change. So it's something where folklore doesn't necessarily agree in all places and all times, and so we kind of have to look to our own experiences and our own common sense and try to figure out what that looks like. In some folklore, the partner of a spirit doesn't gain any powers or become different, except for possibly being watched over by that spirit. But not even always that. Like there are some spirits that are notoriously bad about this. Like I think it's one of the male water fairies. I can't remember if it's Selkies or a different type of water fairy, but they'll go and they will have sex with human women, give them babies, and never come back. So there are some spirits where, and you see that in mythology where a god will have sex with a woman and the woman will have a child, and then the god's just like, whatever, see ya, and is off doing their thing. Um, and so it's not always where there becomes a relationship where the spirit follows and interacts with the human and protects the human and does things for the human. But that is one modality that we do see where that spirit sex can be something where it creates a relationship and there's an interaction and the spirit's there to help the person on an ongoing basis, even if the person doesn't gain powers innately themselves. Uh, and some of that may have to do with the nature of the spirit. Some of it may be due to the nature of the union, and some of it might be the intention of the spirit, or maybe even the intention of the person as to whether or not it creates that kind of change. Again, these are things where there's a lot of different examples that show us different things, and so we kind of have to figure it out. Do children from spirit managers become witches? And how do children even come from these unions? So in folklore, we see that a lot, and folklore doesn't feel the need to explain. A god can come down and have sex with a person, and then there's a baby, and who knows how that happened. But in cases where a spirit maybe moves through a person and a person transitions in as that mysterious stranger experience, that's a way that that could happen. We do see a lot of folklore around children of spirit unions having powers or specialness. Merlin is the son of a demon, traditionally. The Nephilim in the Bible and Jewish Apocrypha, the source of witchcraft in the world, as well as smithing, which is frequently related to magic, and a lot of other things. It also makeup was taught by the angels that were lustful of human women and came down and had sex with them. And so that birthed a race of monstrous giants that were powerful and strong and different from other humans. And it also caused the women to gain witchcraft as a result. Greek heroes. Heroes traditionally are not just any person who goes and does a heroic thing, they're demigods. They're people who are born from unions between gods and humans. In North Atlantic folklore, the Atlantic Isles, particularly in like Wales, you get a lot of examples where the sons from unions with spirit beings and humans become giants, and the daughters become witches. That's a very common way in which witches occur in that folklore mythology. In Eastern Europe, you have the Jmaj, the star dragons. And these star dragons, they're good, they're heroic, but they lust after human women. And sex with them causes the women to become partially spirit, and being partially spirit makes them witches and gives them power. And then their children are either heroes or witches at that point. And so that's an important part of the culture there. And this is something we see throughout folklore around the world, that this power comes along lineally when this spirit sex component is there. And there's also the idea of the witch's familiar. The witch's familiar is frequently a sexual partner in history and folklore, and it's also a source for the witch's power. And in some ways, this is because the familiar teaches the witch witchcraft, but in some ways, the familiar goes and does work for the witch. There's lots of examples where the things that a witch was accused of were things that the familiar is described as doing because they were things that the witch wanted. And when the witch is like, well, what do you want from the familiar? The familiar's like, stay with me. And which seems to be 16th century British slang for let's get it on. The familiar, though, typically isn't how the witch becomes a witch, but sometimes it is. Sometimes the familiar is the first spirit the witch encounters, but in a lot of cases, the witch encounters the witch's devil, which is probably the fairy king, or the queen of Elfame, clearly the fairy queen. And so, regardless of gender, the witch will have carnal relations with either of these beings. Like frequently, women are described as being with the witch's devil, men are described as being with the queen of Elfame, but there is some overlap there where you'll have men also with the witch's devil and women also with the queen of Elfame. And usually that encounter is where the witch power comes from, and the granting of the familiar comes from that encounter as well. Beyond just the carnal option, there's also consumption. You can consume power, consume different natures. Cat Heath, the author of Elves, Witches, and Gods, Spinning Old Heathen Magic in the Modern Day, pointed this out to me in the Norse context, that some elements of witch power in the Norse soul complex relate to the shape of the Hama, which is your form, like the part of your soul that is your shape and being, and the Hugr, or the heart soul, that's the source of desire and thought. So if witches can change their hammer, and so like your form, you can shapeshift. You can also project out elements of your soul, and those elements can go in other forms as a witch. But the hammer can also be changed and reshaped by other beings, like a god or a powerful spirit could reshape your hammer. The hugger, if it's from a non-human source, would make you not fully human. And you could have a non-human hooker from inheriting it, if it was passed down because there were elves in your family at one point, or they can be consumed. There's a story of Loki eating a half-cooked hooker, and he gave birth to the mother of ogres as a result of that. And the mother of ogres sort of inherited this like half-processed, half-developed hooker. And so the qualities of that can be passed on through that consumption. So if someone were to magically consume the hooker of another non-human being and take the form of another non-human being, it would begin to shift what they are and change what they are and give them kinship with these non-human natures. Um, there's also the concept of hugsa, which is an element related to the hugger, and the hugger being the source of desire. Winifred Rose Hodge in Heathen Soul Lore describes this in a way that makes it clear that it's basically the same as the evil eye concept in more southern cultures. Um, but in addition to simply cursing things through desire and envy, it also gives the witch the ability to remove potency and nature from things, which is something that we see commonly in witchcraft accounts, like stealing the potency from beer, stealing the color from dye, stealing the ability of a field to grow wheat. Um, that ability to pull away the nature of things is an inherent part of witchcraft traditionally, and having a hooker that has particular qualities can cause that. And so being able to consume and take in the hooker that has that potential can cause that. I'm gonna rush through because we're like in the last moment now. Pseudo Al-Kindi, the Radi, which is an important magical astrological text, talks about rays emanating from all phenomena in existence. And when a living being is killed unexpectedly, these rays kind of explode out in a dramatic fashion, and there's a big release of power from that. And that's one example of how sacrifice works. There's also several cultures that have magical systems where the sacrifice of an animal allows you to bind their spirit. And this is getting into stuff where it's like not necessarily recommending that anyone go do this, and use that spirit as kind of a familiar or a spirit that's able to go do things for you. But there's also the possibility of combining with the power that's released from that spirit and that spirit nature. And we see in cultures where contemporary anthropology is starting to look at the concept of dark shamanism, the idea that there are shaman figures, people that have spirit flight capabilities that are specifically antagonistic and specifically dangerous, where they go through and they consume from the spirit natures of other humans. And typically, this power is gained by either having a nature or form that's shaped like predatory animals, particularly the jaguar in South America, sometimes serpents, in Europe, particularly the owl and the cat. And this can be acquired either through encountering and consuming some element of that spirit, or having some engagement where you kind of fight and take on a part of that spirit, or it can be something that's naturally there. Um, so we are at the point where class time is over, but I think we're leading into a break. So if you guys want, I can try to wrap things in the next 5 minutes. Okay. So this idea of these dark shamans who they go through and they kind of cannibalize, they go through and they consume power from the souls of other people in the community or other people in the village. It's not the only cannibalism we can look at. The word cannibalizing can also refer to taking something and breaking it apart and reusing its parts to build something else. And that's another way that witches get made in some cultures. Powerful spirits can kind of break apart and cannibalize the human structure and then pull in pieces of soul parts from other types of beings, other types of spirit creatures, and rebuild something new out of that person where there's now parts grafted in from other things. Katerina Piovic, the author of Shmaj from Hadean Press, talked about this in an AMA that I hosted once, where in Balkan's folklore, this is something that spirits and gods do sometimes when they need a witch figure to go do things. They will break apart the soul of a human, and this is a very painful and intense process. And then they'll merge it with other types of spirit beings, so that person now has that kinship with those spirit beings and that connection to those spirit beings, but also elements of the power that those spirit beings have. And so the resulting soul returns to a human body, but it's not fully human anymore. It's now something that's warped and changed and different. And so you've got that warping and that shifting and that interaction and dynamism between different components from different sources, creating that liminality and creating that power that we associate with witchcraft. Now, as we've described those things, that gaining the power through sex with a spirit and warping and shifting yourself because of that exposure to that spirit power, or that insemination of power within the self that warps and changes you, or going through and consuming pieces and reshaping yourself by interacting with and taking parts from other natures and powers within existence, or having a spirit break you apart and put you together with other parts. We're all describing, they're all very related things. The mechanism has slightly different details, but in all of these cases, whether we're talking about reshaping or consumption or insemination, it's all reshaping the human form by encountering and taking in and acquiring pieces that are slightly different from what these human parts are. They're all modes of creating kinship with spirits, whether it's through marriage or intimacy, or whether it is through form and consumption, or whether it is through being rebuilt and sort of Frankensteined into something new. You're taking on components that make you more like these other spirit beings and allow you to navigate their spaces and be recognized by them, but also which makes you something new and frightening to them as well. And so that's something where they can recognize that there's a power there. They can recognize there's a difference there. You're not just othered from humans, you're also kind of othered from these other spirits, and they will react to that and respond to that. And so that gives the witch a little more safety and a little bit more ability to go to these spirits and be like, hey, I've got this power. I've got these things that make me different. I need you to do this. I need you to work with me in this way. So, in conclusion, witch blood or witch fire can be inborn, but it can also be obtained. And obtaining this nature is based on breaking and creating some break or change in the human spirit complex or human soul complex and interweaving it with divine and spirit components. So modern modes of traditional witchcraft kind of talk about this, but they talk about it in the sense of becoming spirit or haunting your world. And it's frequently viewed as kind of creating bonds, building perception of the spirit world, building perception of spirits, spending a lot of time in spirit spaces and kind of consortium with spirits, as opposed to like directly, brutally making some change or making some deep intrinsic change. It's kind of like exposure and interaction to the time where you kind of acclimate yourself to spirit culture. And so it addresses the idea of consistent exposure and activity as a means of changing identity and perception from one that's fully human to one that's more and more rooted in straddling human and spirit spaces. But it is still slightly different from this idea of like breaking down and rebuilding something, or reshaping and consuming things, or letting that fire be placed in you and having that warp and shift and change you and grow you into something new. Um, and I think that's like kind of a good place to kind of wrap things there. Um, we can look at whether or not these are the same or adjacent concepts. We can look at whether or not they do the same things or they do adjacent things. But these are questions that the individual unravels through experience and through exploration and comparison with themselves and with other human spirit kinfolk who have this experience and have this power and have this nature that they've taken on. We can all kind of work together to explore things and find things and figure out how this works, because all we've got are pieces. We have pieces broken and scattered throughout the world, from all these different bits of folklore and these different cultures. And we can look at them, and we look at how they interact and how they work, but then we also have to look at how they ground in our lives and how they work with us and work with our experience and the experiences of people around us, and whether or not they're meaningful for our experience. Some people don't need this. Some people don't want this. There's lots of modes of magic. And there's lots of ways to be predispositioned towards magic as well. There's lots of different types of talent that someone can have, and there's lots of different types of skill, and talent can get in the way of skill. Sometimes it's better to just study and develop and have skill than to have some sort of talent that's there, whether it's inborn or one that you create through these spirit adventures. Um, but it's all personal and individual, and it's important that all these different modes exist and that we seek to understand them instead of trying to kind of lump them together all as one thing all the time. And I think that's kind of the big takeaway I hope people have, is that there's a diversity of magic and a diversity of magic experience, and they are meaningfully different. But that meaningful difference can be a way in which things can kind of come together and learn from each other and interact with each other, as opposed to necessarily having to separate everything out all the time. So I hope that was enjoyable and interesting for people.
Thank you.
Thank you. And so if anyone had any questions, I'm not in